The Iron Marshal Georgi Zukov. He stopped the German army at the gates of Moscow when everyone said it was impossible. He commanded the defense of Stalingrad when the city was in ruins and the battle seemed lost. He led the final assault on Berlin, planting the Soviet flag on the Reichstag. He never lost a major battle in 4 years of war. But after victory, Stalin feared him so much that he exiled and humiliated the man who had saved the Soviet Union. This is the story of the general who defeated Nazi Germany and then became a victim of the regime he had saved. Stay until the end to discover what he said about the cost of Soviet victory, words so honest they were censored for decades. Georgi Konstantinovich Zukov was born on December 1, 1896, in Strelkovka, a small village about 60 miles south of Moscow in the Russian Empire. He was born into grinding poverty. His family were peasants who worked land they didn't own, barely surviving through subsistence farming. His father, Konstantin Artemyevich Zhukov, worked as a furrier and laborer to supplement farming income. His mother, Ustinya Artemyevna, raised Georgi and his siblings in a tiny wooden hut with a dirt floor where the family sometimes went hungry during bad harvests. Young Georgi, called Jura by his family, learned from birth that life was hard, that survival required toughness, and that sentimentality was a luxury poor people couldn't afford. Georgi's childhood was shaped by relentless poverty and hard physical labor. From age 7, he worked in the fields during harvest, helped care for livestock, and did whatever labor the family needed. Education was minimal, a few years of village school where he learned basic reading, writing, and arithmetic. There was no money for books, no opportunity for advanced education, no possibility of escaping the peasant life. Georgi's future seemed predetermined. He would be a peasant laborer like his father, struggling to survive, living and dying in obscurity. At age 11, Georgi was sent to Moscow to work as an apprentice furrier, learning to prepare and work with animal furs. This was common for poor rural children. Families sent them to cities to learn trades, with the children sending money home to help support younger siblings. Georgi lived in his employer's workshop, working long hours in difficult conditions for minimal pay. It was a hard life, but it was also educational. In Moscow, Georgi saw industrial development, political activism, and a world far beyond his rural village. In 1915, during World War I, 18-year-old Georgi was conscripted into the Imperial Russian Army. Russia was fighting Germany and Austria-Hungary, suffering catastrophic casualties due to poor leadership, inadequate equipment, and corruption throughout the military system. Georgi was assigned to a cavalry regiment, not because he knew horses particularly well, but because the army needed cavalry men and he was physically tough enough to survive the brutal training. Georgi proved to be an exceptional soldier. He was fearless in combat, physically strong, and able to endure hardships that broke other men. He was promoted to non-commissioned officer and awarded the Cross of St. George twice for bravery in combat. He fought on the Western Front against German forces, participating in cavalry charges and reconnaissance missions. The war was horrific. Millions of Russian soldiers died in battles that accomplished nothing, but Georgi survived, learning to command men under fire and developing the toughness that would define his career. Then came 1917, the Russian Revolution. Tsar Nicholas II abdicated in March. The provisional government tried to continue the war but faced increasing opposition. In November, the Bolsheviks under Lenin seized power, promising peace, land, and bread. Russia withdrew from World War I through the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, ceding vast territories to Germany in exchange for peace. But peace with Germany didn't bring peace to Russia. Civil war erupted between the Bolshevik Reds and anti-Bolshevik Whites, with various foreign inventor powers intervening on both sides. Georgi Zukov joined the Red Army in 1918. He wasn't particularly communist ideologically. He joined because the Reds represented peasants and workers, while the Whites represented the old aristocratic system that had kept people like him in poverty. The Russian Civil War was brutal,
with both sides committing atrocities. Zhukov fought as a cavalry officer, commanding Red Army cavalry units against white forces, anarchist armies, and foreign interventionists. The fighting was savage, no quarter given, prisoners often executed, entire villages destroyed. Zhukov learned that war was about will and ruthlessness, not gentlemanly conduct. The Reds won the Civil War by 1922, establishing the Soviet Union as a communist state. Zhukov, now an experienced combat officer, remained in the Red Army. The Soviet military in the 1920s was rebuilding, trying to learn from World War I and the Civil War, developing new tactics and training professional officers. Zhukov attended military academies, studying military science, tactics, and leadership. He was intelligent and dedicated, compensating for his limited formal education through relentless study. Through the 1920s and 30s, Zhukov rose through Red Army ranks. He commanded cavalry units, served in staff positions, and attended advanced military courses. He impressed superiors with his competence, his ability to train soldiers effectively, and his willingness to make hard decisions without sentimentality. He was being groomed for high command, recognized as one of the Red Army's most capable officers. But in the 1930s, terror came to the Soviet Union. Joseph Stalin, consolidating power, launched the Great Purge, a campaign of mass arrests, show trials, and executions targeting anyone suspected of disloyalty. The Red Army was devastated. Stalin purged approximately 30,000 officers, including most senior commanders. Experienced generals were arrested, tortured into confessing fabricated crimes, and executed. The purge destroyed the Red Army's leadership, leaving inexperienced officers in command positions they weren't qualified for. Zhukov survived the purges, though many of his colleagues and friends were arrested and shot. Survival required political skill, demonstrating absolute loyalty to Stalin while avoiding actions that could be interpreted as disloyalty. Zhukov wasn't naturally political, but he learned to navigate the system, to praise Stalin effusively, and to avoid expressing opinions that could be construed as criticism. His survival also depended on luck. Stalin's paranoia was arbitrary, and many loyal officers were executed on false accusations. Zhukov was lucky.
In 1939, Zhukov received a combat command that would make his reputation. Japanese forces and Soviet forces were fighting an undeclared border war in Mongolia, where the Soviet Union supported the Mongolian government against Japanese expansion. The Japanese inflicted several defeats on Soviet forces, and Stalin needed a victory to deter further Japanese aggression. He sent Zhukov to command Soviet and Mongolian forces at Khalkhin-Gol, also called Nomonhan. Zhukov arrived in Mongolia and immediately assessed the situation. Previous Soviet commanders had fought defensively, reacting to Japanese initiatives. Zhukov decided on offensive action. He would mass Soviet forces, surprise the Japanese with overwhelming attack, and destroy their forces decisively. He assembled tanks, aircraft, artillery, and infantry, coordinated a combined arms assault, and in August 1939 launched a devastating offensive that encircled and destroyed Japanese forces. The Battle of Khalkhin-Gol was a Soviet victory that demonstrated Zhukov's tactical brilliance. He used tactics that would later become his signature, massing forces for decisive attacks, coordinating different military branches effectively, and maintaining relentless pressure on enemies. Japanese forces were crushed, suffering approximately 45,000 casualties compared to about 17,000 Soviet casualties. The victory convinced Japan to avoid further conflict with the Soviet Union, allowing Stalin to focus on the West when Germany invaded in 1941. Zhukov returned to the Soviet Union as a hero. He was promoted to general and given increasingly important commands. In 1940, he was appointed commander of the Kiev Military District, one of the most important defensive sectors given its proximity to German-controlled Poland. Zhukov understood that war with Germany was likely and worked to prepare Soviet forces for modern mechanized warfare. On June 22, 1941, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa. the invasion of the Soviet Union with over 3 million soldiers. It was the largest military invasion in history. German forces advanced rapidly, destroying Soviet armies that were unprepared for German tactics and speed. Within weeks, German forces had advanced hundreds of miles, encircling entire Soviet armies, killing or capturing millions of Soviet soldiers. The Soviet Union appeared to be on the verge of collapse. Stalin appointed Zhukov as chief of the general staff, responsible for coordinating Soviet military strategy. Zhukov immediately faced catastrophic situations. German forces were advancing toward Moscow, Leningrad, and Ukraine simultaneously. Soviet armies were being destroyed faster than they could be rebuilt. Stalin and other Soviet leaders were considering abandoning Moscow and retreating deeper into the Soviet Union. The war seemed lost. But Zhukov refused to accept defeat. He argued against abandoning Moscow, insisting that defending the capital was both militarily necessary and psychologically crucial for Soviet morale. He organized desperate counterattacks, using whatever forces could be assembled, buying time for reinforcements to arrive. He was ruthless. Commanders who retreated without orders were court-martialed and shot. Units that failed to hold positions were disbanded, their commanders executed. It was brutal, but Zhukov believed only extreme measures could stop the German advance. In October 1941, German forces launched the final assault on Moscow. The Soviet government evacuated to Kuybyshev, now Samara, though Stalin remained in Moscow. Zhukov commanded a defensive Moscow, coordinating armies defending the approaches to the city. The battle was desperate. German forces came within 15 miles of the Kremlin, close enough that Soviet leaders could see German artillery flashes from their office windows. But Zhukov had been quietly assembling reserves, fresh divisions from Siberia and Central Asia, troops that had been defending against possible Japanese attack but were now rushed west. In December 1941, with German forces exhausted and overextended, Zhukov launched a massive counteroffensive. Soviet forces attacked along the entire front around Moscow, pushing German forces back 100 to 150 miles, inflicting Germany's first major defeat of World War II. The Battle of Moscow was a turning point. Hitler's blitzkrieg had failed. The Soviet Union had survived. And Georgi Zhukov had established himself as the Soviet Union's most capable military commander. Stalin recognized Zhukov's abilities, but also began to fear him. Zhukov was popular with soldiers, successful in battle, and potentially a political rival. Stalin needed Zhukov, but didn't trust him. In 1942, German forces launched a new offensive aimed at Stalingrad, a major industrial city on the Volga River. Capturing Stalingrad would cut Soviet north-south communications and provide access to Soviet oil fields in the Caucasus. The battle for Stalingrad became the most brutal urban combat in history. Soldiers fighting building to building, room to room, sometimes floor by floor within the same building. Casualties were horrific on both sides. Zhukov was sent to coordinate the defense of Stalingrad. The city was in ruins. Soviet forces were being pushed back to the Volga River, and German victory seemed certain. But Zhukov developed a plan. Allow the German forces to exhaust themselves in urban combat, while secretly assembling massive reserves for a counteroffensive. He would let the Germans think they were winning, while preparing a trap. In November 1942, Soviet forces launched Operation Uranus, a massive pincer movement that encircled the entire German Sixth Army at Stalingrad. Over 300,000 German soldiers were trapped. German relief attempts failed. By February 1943, the surrounded Germans, starving and freezing, surrendered. The Battle of Stalingrad cost over 1 million Soviet casualties, but destroyed Germany's offensive capability on the Eastern Front. Zhukov coordinated or commanded Soviet operations in virtually every major battle from 1943 to 1945. The Battle of Kursk in 1943, where Soviet forces defeated Germany's last major offensive. The liberation of Ukraine and Belarus in 1943 to 1944. The Vistula-Oder offensive in early 1945 that brought Soviet forces to Germany's border.
And finally, the Battle of Berlin in April-May 1945, where Zhukov's forces captured the German capital and forced Nazi Germany's surrender.
Zhukov was at the height of his power and fame. He had commanded Soviet forces in every major victory. Soldiers worshipped him. Soviet propaganda celebrated him as the greatest military leader of the war. He represented Soviet military might and Soviet victory over Nazi Germany. But this fame made Stalin intensely suspicious and jealous. After the war, Stalin systematically reduced Zhukov's power and influence. He was removed from high command positions, sent to minor military districts, and publicly criticized for supposedly taking credit for victories that belonged to Stalin. Zhukov was accused of Bonapartism, the accusation that he wanted to use military popularity to seize political power. It was absurd. Zhukov was loyal and had no political ambitions, but Stalin was paranoid and saw threats everywhere. In 1946, Zhukov was demoted and sent to command the Odessa military district, a relatively minor assignment far from Moscow. He watched as other wartime commanders were arrested, tortured, and executed or sent to gulags. Zhukov expected arrest daily, knowing that Stalin's paranoia could turn on him at any moment. He lived under constant surveillance, knowing that any word or action could be interpreted as disloyalty and result in arrest. Stalin died in March 1953, and Zhukov's fortunes improved. He was brought back to Moscow, restored to high military command, and appointed Minister of Defense. He supported Nikita Khrushchev in the political struggles that followed Stalin's death, helping Khrushchev consolidate power by ensuring military loyalty. Zhukov was finally receiving the recognition he deserved for his wartime service. But Khrushchev, like Stalin before him, eventually came to fear Zhukov's popularity and power. In 1957, Khrushchev removed Zhukov from the Ministry of Defense and forced him into retirement, accusing him of political ambitions and insufficient loyalty to the Communist Party. Zhukov, now 61 years old, was pushed out of public life. His immense contributions to Soviet victory gradually downplayed or attributed to collective Soviet efforts rather than individual genius. Zhukov spent his retirement writing memoirs, which were heavily censored by Soviet authorities. He wanted to write honestly about the war, the mistakes, the enormous casualties, Stalin's blunders, but censors removed anything critical of Stalin or Soviet leadership. The published version of his memoirs was sanitized, presenting Soviet victory as inevitable and minimizing the human cost. Zhukov died on June 18, 1974, age 77. His funeral was attended by thousands, and he was buried at the Kremlin Wall necropolis, an honor reserved for the most important Soviet leaders. But even in death, his legacy was complicated. Soviet authorities were uncertain how to remember him, as a great military leader whose genius saved the Soviet Union and was then persecuted by the regime he had saved, a man who commanded battles that killed millions but questioned whether there might have been a better way. After the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, previously censored materials became available. Historians gained access to military archives, uncensored memoirs, and documents that revealed the full scope of Zhukov's contributions and the enormous human cost of Soviet victory. Modern historians recognize Zhukov as one of the 20th century's greatest military commanders, comparable to figures like Eisenhower, Montgomery, and Rommel. But Zhukov's legacy is also controversial. His tactics emphasized massing overwhelming force, accepting enormous casualties, and ruthlessly executing officers who failed. Soviet casualties in battles Zhukov commanded were often catastrophically high. Millions of soldiers died in operations he planned. His defenders argue these casualties were necessary given the circumstances, and that Zhukov saved millions more by defeating Nazi Germany. His critics argue that he was callously indifferent to human life, treating soldiers as expendable resources. The moment that defines Georgi Zhukov's legacy came from his uncensored memoirs, published only after the Soviet Union collapsed. A section that had been completely removed by Soviet censors described his feelings about the war's cost.
Zukov wrote about walking through Soviet villages after the war, seeing the massive casualty lists, realizing that entire generations of young men had been killed. He wrote, "We won the war, but the cost was terrible. Over 25 million Soviet citizens died. I ordered attacks that killed hundreds of thousands of our own soldiers. I did what was necessary to defeat Germany, but I will carry the weight of those deaths for the rest of my life. Victory doesn't erase the cost. It only makes us wonder whether we could have won with fewer deaths. I don't know the answer. And that uncertainty is my burden." That was Georgi Zukov, the general who never lost a major battle, the commander who defeated Nazi Germany, a military genius who saved the Soviet Union, and then persecuted by the regime he had saved. A man who commanded battles that killed millions but questioned whether there might have been a better way. His story reminds us that even great military victories come at terrible human costs, and that the victors often carry the weight of those costs for the rest of their lives.